Alright, here's another short video for you. This one describes how to use arrays in Blender, in particular how to do radial arrays. Now an array is something that's called duplicate special in Maya, but pretty much every other 3D program I think considers it an array. And the idea is to be able to create lots of copies or duplicates really quickly, and to allow you to transform those duplicates sort of in increments or relative to the previous duplicate. So to start, the first thing I'm going to do to start is I'm going to create a cube. Shift A, add mesh, cube. Okay. And I'm going to do a little scaling to this original item. I'm going to hit S and then Z, scale it down a little bit. I could also just hit N, open up my side panel, and just enter in some, say, whole values, say 0.2. I'm going to scale this out in the X a little bit, maybe to 4, and maybe I'll do a 0.75 for the Y, something like that. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do here is, my plan is to duplicate this or create an array that's a radial array where this sort of spins around. And you always want to consider the pivot point. You'll notice if I start to rotate this thing, you can see that it's just rotating around the center. And actually what I'm going to try doing here is, I'm going to succeed in moving this over and then repositioning the pivot point back at the origin. So I think I'm just going to, again, I could either use transforms. I could also turn on grid snap. Make sure my it's on, and then I can start moving this G, X, and then just say move it over, say to something like there. Okay. Now it is not just a nice idea, but necessary for control to apply all of your transforms before you move on to the array. If you hit Control A, I'm not sure whether this is on by default, I forget, but I've got it set up as a pie menu. You can see I've got applying rotation, scale, location, or you can also apply all here, and that's what I'm going to do here. It just applies all three at once. And you'll notice when I do that, it's zeroing out, or sort of zeroing out the location and rotation, and the scale now is set to 1, 1, 1, even though I had changed the values earlier. You'll also notice now when I rotate around the Z-axis, it has also taken the location, when it applied the location, should I say, it moved the origin back to this spot, back to the center of the XYZ space. This is now ready for the next step. Now you can also, if I right click, I can set the origin to geometry. You'll notice now the pivot point's back at the middle. I could then do something like just manually set the origin. Say I'll do a right click, set origin to 3D cursor. My 3D cursor happened to be over here in the center, so I'll back to where I want it to be. Okay, next step. Select your model, go over here to your modifier panel, add modifier, array. Now you'll notice this is perhaps the first confusing part about trying to do a radial array, which is you end up with, it's actually a single additional copy. They consider total count, including the first example. And you can see that right over here in the panel. It's set to 2. If I type in, say, 3, you can see now I've got 3 of them. And what it's doing is it's actually by default setting up a relative offset. A relative offset specifically of 1 in the x-axis. So you'll notice if I go over to wireframe view, it's actually moving each one over 1 unit. That's why it sort of looks like it's one solid block. It's actually, each one is just right next to the previous one. Okay, I go back to solid. So instead of using this relative offset, in order to get a radial array to work, I need to turn this off. So I'm just going to go ahead and shut that off. I think while I'm at it, maybe I'm going to increase my count to something like, we'll just try 8 total. Now you can't see these copies yet because there's no offset. It's basically just creating 8 copies or duplicates right on top of the original. The next thing you need to do to get this to work is to add in another object that's going to basically serve as a guide for rotating or doing other translations to this thing. It's common practice to add in what's called an empty. An empty is simply a point in space. It's a point in space that has translation information. It's got your transform information. It's got these values to work with, but it doesn't actually render. It's not actual geometry. You can add this in by going to Shift A, add, empty, and there are lots of different types. I'm just going to choose the first one, plane axes, and you'll notice, maybe a little hard to see, but now I get this basically a crosshairs. You can see if I move it away, that's all it is. It's just a point in space. It's got a name called empty. You can rename that if you want. I'm just going to leave that alone. But now, actually, I'm going to turn off my grid snap, just because. Now when I go back and select my original cube and look over here in the panel for array, you'll notice there's an option for turning on something called an object offset. I'm going to turn that on. And you'll notice right below that there's this empty field which I need to use to select this parent or this object that's going to do the guiding or controlling of this cube. Now I can do this in one of two ways. I can either eyedropper the thing I want. I can eyedropper over here to the object empty, or I can just click right in here, and you'll notice it'll actually show me I don't have much in my scene. In fact, there's only one thing listed, which is the empty. So now you can see I've actually assigned or created an object offset. I now have the empty serving as the guide. You'll notice now, for instance, if I grab my empty, this is going to start to control what happens to this cube. So for instance, now if I rotate this around the z-axis, sure enough, we're getting the option that for what we want. And you'll notice I should have 8 total. Probably a good idea to do something like type in 45, and you'll notice now I have perfect separation between them. Okay. Now the next thing I can do here, on top of rotating this, is I can also, for instance, move it. So if I start grabbing and then grab along and move this along the z-axis, this is how you can start to create something like a spiral staircase. And again, you could put in precise values over here, but that's long story short, that's how you can use or create a radial array by using some kind of an object offset. All right.